You can hear the screams before you can see anything. It is August 1971 in the basement of Stanford University's psychology department. The sound is not coming from a prison. It is coming from a simulation. But to the young men inside those makeshift cells, the line between reality and role-play has already begun to blur. One prisoner is sobbing uncontrollably. Another stands catatonic in a corner, and the guards are laughing. They are stripping the prisoners naked. They are forcing them to simulate sodomy with their bare hands. They are inflicting psychological torture for no reason other than the fact that they can. This is not a story about bad people. This is a story about how good people become bad. This is the Stanford Prison Experiment. The year is 1971. The United States is embroiled in the Vietnam War. Prison reform is a hot political topic. There are riots at Attica. There are reports of brutal conditions in correctional facilities across the country. The public wants to know if prison violence comes from inside the inmates or from the system itself. Enter Philip Zimbardo, a charismatic psychology professor at Stanford University. He wants to test a simple hypothesis. Is the brutality we see in prisons a product of the personalities of guards and prisoners, or is it a product of the prison environment itself? He wants to know if the situation can overpower an individual's moral compass. To find out, he builds a mock prison in the basement of the psychology building. He places an ad in the local newspaper. It reads, "Male college students needed for psychological study of prison life, $15 per day." The response is overwhelming. Over 75 young men apply. Zimbardo and his team interview them extensively. They conduct personality tests. They screen for psychological issues. They deliberately choose the most stable, the most mature, the most average individuals. They want to prove that ordinary people remain ordinary, regardless of the situation. They want to prove that the environment does not matter. They were wrong. 24 participants are selected. They are all white, middle-class male students from respectable universities. They are randomly assigned to be either a guard or a prisoner. There is no difference between them. They are identical in every measurable way. The only difference is the role they are about to play. The prisoners are arrested at their homes by real Palo Alto police officers, handcuffed, read their rights, fingerprinted, processed. They are driven to the basement blindfolded. The humiliation begins before they even see the cell. They are stripped naked. They are deloused with a spray. They are given a loose smock to wear, no underwear, a nylon stocking cap for their hair. They are issued a chain around one ankle. They are given a number. They lose their names. In a matter of hours, these college students have been transformed into inmates. The guards, meanwhile, are given no specific training. They are told simply to maintain order. They are given khaki uniforms, mirrored sunglasses, a whistle, and a wooden baton. That is it. That is the entire instruction. Zimbardo expects the guards to behave professionally. He expects boredom. He expects the experiment to be uneventful. He expects to prove his hypothesis that the system does not create monsters. Day 1 starts normally. The prisoners are processed. They are locked into their cells. The guards stand at their posts. There is a sense of awkwardness. The participants are still themselves. They joke, they laugh, they try to figure out the purpose of the study. But something shifts very quickly. The guards begin to assert their authority. It starts small. A guard makes a prisoner do a push-up for talking out of turn. Another guard shouts at a prisoner for looking at him. The prisoners, confused but compliant, obey, and that compliance is the first crack in the wall. The guards realize that they can give orders. The prisoners realize that they must follow them. The roles begin to sink in. By the end of day 1, the atmosphere has changed. The joking has stopped. The prisoners are quieter. The guards are louder. The experiment has only been running for a few hours, and already the transformation has begun. Day 2 is where the nightmare starts to surface. The prisoners, uncomfortable with the dehumanization, decide to rebel. They barricade their cell doors with their beds. They rip off their stocking caps. They shout at the guards. They refuse to come out for the count. They demand to see the warden. This is the critical moment. This is the test. The guards could have handled this calmly. They could have negotiated. They could have called the whole thing off. They did none of that. Instead, they panicked. Then they retaliated. They grabbed fire extinguishers and sprayed the prisoners with carbon dioxide. They stormed the cells. They stripped the prisoners naked. They dragged them out. They put the ringleaders in solitary confinement. They began to use psychological tactics designed explicitly to break the prisoners' will. They separated them. They played favorites. They gave some prisoners better treatment to create a rift between them. They forced the prisoners to do push-ups while the guards stood on their backs. They forced them to clean toilets with their bare hands. And the prison warden, a role Zimbardo himself had taken on, did not stop it. He watched. He took notes. He allowed it to happen because it was good data. The guards had internalized their power. Zimbardo had internalized his authority. The prisoners had internalized their helplessness. The simulation was no longer a simulation. Day 3, the abuse escalates. The guards, drunk on their unchecked authority, begin to experiment with cruelty. They invent punishments. They make the prisoners chant degrading songs. They force them to simulate sexual acts. They deny them bathroom breaks. They lock them in a dark closet known as the hole for hours on end. The prisoners begin to break down mentally. One prisoner, prisoner 8612, starts to scream uncontrollably. He sobs. He has a rash all over his body. He is clearly in psychological distress. Zimbardo interviews him. The prisoner is shattered. He begs to be released. Zimbardo is conflicted. He does not want to lose a participant. He thinks about the integrity of the experiment. He decides to let the prisoner go, but this is not an act of compassion. It is a calculated move. Zimbardo wants to see what happens to the other prisoners when they see someone getting out. He wants to see if it gives them hope. It does not. The remaining prisoners are crushed. They realize that cooperation, not rebellion, is the only path to survival. The guards realize they can do anything, and they do. Day 4, the guards introduce the privilege cell. They take 3 prisoners and put them in a separate area. They give them better food. They let them wash. They give them back their uniforms. The other prisoners are enraged. They begin to turn on each other. The guards have successfully destroyed any sense of solidarity. The prisoners start to blame themselves. They start to believe they deserve the punishment. They start to act like real prisoners. They internalize their roles to such a degree that they forget they are part of an experiment. They forget they can leave at any time. This is one of the most terrifying aspects of the Stanford Prison Experiment. The prisoners had signed consent forms. They were not being physically restrained. They were not in a real prison, yet they did not walk out. They believed they could not. The situation had become their reality. The power of the environment had overridden their free will. Day 5, the abuse reaches its peak. The guards become sadistic. They force prisoners to clean toilets with their toothbrushes. They force them to sing sad songs while the guards laugh. They sexually humiliate them. One guard, later known as John Wayne, becomes particularly notorious. He is a gentle, quiet man in his normal life, a pacifist. In the experiment, he becomes the most aggressive guard of all. He invents the most creative punishments. He revels in the power. He becomes a monster, and he does not realize it. The line between role and identity has evaporated. The guards are no longer playing a part. They are acting on instinct. The prisoners are no longer resisting. They are broken. Day 6. Zimbardo receives a visitor. Christina Maslach, a recent PhD graduate, and his girlfriend, comes to the basement to observe. She is a social psychologist. She walks through the prison. She sees the guards shouting. She sees the prisoners shuffling in chains. She sees the naked men in the closet. She sees the filth. She sees the despair, and she starts to cry. She pulls Zimbardo aside. She tells him that what he is doing is wrong. She tells him that this is not an experiment anymore. It is a hell. It is an atrocity. Zimbardo does not see it. He has been the warden for 6 days. He has not slept. He has not eaten properly. He has been in the basement, immersed in the very system he created. He is no longer a scientist. He is a prison administrator. He tries to convince Maslach that the experiment is valuable, that the data is important, that they are testing a theory. She refuses to accept it. She tells him he has a moral obligation to stop. That conversation, that confrontation from someone he trusted, is the only thing that breaks the spell. Zimbardo finally sees the basement for what it is. He ends the experiment. It has been only 6 days. It was scheduled to last 2 weeks. The aftermath is devastating. Zimbardo is praised for his research but condemned for his methods. The participants carry psychological scars for years. Some of the guards express deep shame. Some never fully understand what happened to them. Some are proud of what they did. Zimbardo himself suffers from the experience. He realizes he failed as an ethical leader. He allowed the system to corrupt him. He became the very thing he was studying. The Stanford Prison Experiment becomes one of the most famous and controversial studies in the history of psychology. It is taught in every introductory class. It is cited in discussions about abuse, power, and institutional violence, but it is also heavily criticized. Later researchers point out massive flaws. The experiment lacked a control group. The participants were encouraged by the experimenters to act tough. The guards were given implicit permission to be harsh. Zimbardo himself admitted to being biased. He wanted a certain result. But despite these critiques, the core lesson remains. The situation matters. The environment matters. The system matters. So what are the psychological mechanisms that drove this transformation? The first is deindividuation. The guards wore mirrored sunglasses. They could not be seen. They could not be identified. They lost their individual identity and became part of a mob. The prisoners lost their names. They lost their clothes. They lost their personal history. They became numbers. When you strip away identity, you strip away accountability. When you cannot be seen, you feel free to act without conscience. The second mechanism is obedience to authority. Zimbardo was the warden. He was the professor. He was the authority figure. The guards obeyed him. They assumed he knew what he was doing. They assumed that if he allowed the abuse must be acceptable. This is exactly the same dynamic Stanley Milgram found in his infamous shock experiments. Ordinary people will inflict extreme harm if a legitimate authority tells them to. The third mechanism is role internalization. The participants did not just pretend to be guards and prisoners. They became guards and prisoners. They internalized the expectations of the role. The guards believed they had to be tough. The prisoners believed they had to be submissive. They performed their roles so convincingly that they convinced themselves. This is the power of cognitive dissonance. When you act like a guard, your brain changes to justify that behavior. You tell yourself that the prisoners deserve it. You tell yourself that you are just doing your job. You tell yourself lies until the lies become your truth. The fourth mechanism is systemic power. The Stanford Prison Experiment was not just about individual cruelty. It was about the structure of power itself. The guards had no checks on their authority. There were no cameras. There was no oversight. There was no union. There was no complaint process. The system was designed to give one group total control and the other group total submission. That design creates abuse. It does not matter who fills the roles. Put any group of ordinary people into that system and the same thing will happen. It is not about the people. It is about the environment. Zimbardo calls this the Lucifer effect. It is the idea that good people can be transformed into monsters by the situations they are placed in. Now, decades later, the Stanford Prison Experiment still echoes. The most direct parallel is Abu Ghraib. In 2003, American military police at the Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq tortured and humiliated detainees. They took photographs. They stacked naked prisoners in pyramids. They forced them to simulate sex acts. They laughed. The world was horrified. The question was the same. Were these soldiers bad apples, or was the system rotten? The answer, as Zimbardo argued, is that the system created the conditions for the abuse. The soldiers were under stress. They had no training. They had no oversight. They were given authority without accountability. They were told to soften up the detainees. They dehumanized their prisoners. They became guards in a basement. The same psychological mechanisms were at play. We see this pattern everywhere, in corporate scandals, in police brutality cases, in hazing rituals, in online trolling. Anonymity, authority, and role adoption can turn a gentle person into a cruel one. The Stanford Prison Experiment is a warning. It tells us that we are not as strong as we think. Our morality is not a fixed trait. It is a fragile construct that depends entirely on our environment. We can resist, but it takes effort. It takes awareness. It takes safeguards. The experiment shows us that we need checks on power. We need accountability. We need to question authority, especially when it seems normal. We need to remember that the most dangerous people are not the obvious villains. They are the ordinary people who believe they are just following orders. The final lesson of the Stanford Prison Experiment is not about the prisoners or the guards. It is about you. It is about the moment you are put in a position of unchecked power. What will you do? Will you be the guard who walks away? Will you be the prisoner who refuses to break? Will you be the Zimbardo who listens to the voice that says stop? The experiment ended after 6 days, but the question it asks has not ended. It lingers, it waits, and it applies to every single one of us. The basement is always there. The costumes are always available. The roles are always waiting. The only thing that stops the transformation is a conscious, deliberate act of will. So ask yourself, are you sure you would say no? Are you sure you would walk away? Or are you just a few days in a basement away from becoming someone else entirely?